Hey there, All About Agatha fans. Mel Marie here to tell you that if you want more of Kemper and Catherine, just tune into my show, Keynote, on Thursday, September 13th at 8 p.m. Central on 88.1 FM WUWF, listener-supported NPR for Florida's Great Northwest. Keynote is a weekly hour of genre-specific music. You'll hear some of the classics from punk's rich history alongside emerging artists inspired by those hits of the past. They come together under a lyrically inspired theme to form a playlist that celebrates rock's many subgenres. And on September 13th, our theme is none other than the Queen of Mystery herself, Agatha Christie. The episode will feature guest appearances by Kemper and Catherine, peppered among an hour of Christie-inspired tracks. Join us as we celebrate Agatha Christie's birthday by going to wuwf.org and listening live to Keynote at 8 p.m. Central on September 13th.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
This week we are tackling another short story from a collection that we're very fond of.
Very near and dear to Catherine's heart.
I like them. I think they're unusual. That would be the Listerdale Mystery Collection. And so we are tackling, in this episode, Accident, which I would say has a really kind of singular title for Christie. We don't get a lot of these one-word titles, do we?
Singular in two senses, yeah.
Yeah.
No, agreed. When I came across it as the next story that we were going to cover, I was struck by the title because her titles are usually more descriptive than that and less artful. It has a lot of impact, doesn't it? It's intriguing, and I think that that is indicative of the story itself because, spoiler, we were both big fans of this one.
It's really good. It's worth the 20 minutes that it will take you to read, if that.
Maybe 10.
10, yeah.
This is a short little story, but it is worth
short.
Every minute that it would take you to read it. So Accident was first published in September 1929 in the Sunday Dispatch, which I don't believe we've ever come across as one of the periodicals in which Christie published short stories. It was, of course, published under a different title because it's always published under a different title. That was
right?
The Uncrossed Path. Not as good of a title. And then it was published as part of the Listerdale Mystery Collection in 1934. And like a lot of these Listerdale Mystery short stories, it was published much later in the U.S., although not in The Golden Ball and Other Stories, which is where a lot of those Listerdale Mystery short stories seem to have ended up, but in The Witness for the Prosecution and Other Stories, which was published in the U.S. in 1948. That also happens to be the home of Sing a Song of Sixpence and Philomel Cottage, which we have already covered from the Listerdale Mystery Collection. All right, let's talk about our victim, Catherine Brobeck.
Well, our victim is one Mr. Anthony, who was an arsenic eater, which was interesting. And he died from an OD from, would you care to guess what drug?
Could it be arsenic?
That seems possible. A few years previously, there was an investigation about it because there was perhaps some concerns that because he was such an adept, quote-unquote, arsenic eater, maybe he'd actually been murdered by Mrs. Anthony, his wife.
Right. And I actually only know about arsenic eaters from A is for Arsenic by Catherine Harkup, that wonderful reference book for Christie readers, which we've referenced before on the podcast. And people did, in fact, take arsenic medicinally in a homeopathic way because it was supposed to make your skin look good and just give you a healthful appearance.
Women used it in particular, right? I mean, that's what it's most notorious for, is because it would whiten your skin.
Right. And it's like, hey, you're poisoning yourself, but you sure look pretty. But I guess this is a rare male arsenic eater. He just liked the way it made him feel.
Let me just point out, and I don't say this at all facetiously, but the number of places you can go and have botulism injected into your face is pretty high.
Yeah, these practices continue to this day.
Yeah.
So we only have one suspect here because this is not a puzzle mystery. This is a sort of outlier within the Christie of, because it's also really not an adventure story or a quote-unquote thriller. But Our suspect is Mrs. Anthony, the one that people think maybe actually murdered our arsenic eater, Mr. Anthony, and she is now known as Mrs. Merrodine, and she is an attractive-ish woman and a possible murderess. But she is the only suspect, and she is very much a suspect, and that is, in fact, the entire focus of this story is, did Mrs. Anthony murder someone?
Well, I guess there's another question, right? Is Mrs. Merrodine actually Mrs. Anthony?
Right. And if she is Mrs. Anthony, is she about to murder again?
Is she, like, on a hot streak?
All right, let's talk about the world as it appears to be.
This is a relatively short story, and the only clue, which I think is probably now obvious up front, is tonal. It's a tonal clue. I think it's very well written, especially for an early story. In our novel podcast, we talk a lot about tone and atmosphere when we're talking about rankings, and this deserves immediately very high marks. That said, if you see what the tone is, you probably can guess where the story is going. And I think that in a bit we can talk about some other short stories that actually have, I think, a lot of similarities to this, but suffice it to say, this is very short and it's brutal, especially for pretty early Christie. I mean, not that early of Christie, but it's pretty brutal.
Short, nasty, and brutish.
Yes.
It is, which we love.
Yeah, I love some nice Pablo Poirot. Do not get me wrong ever on that front, but this is dark.
We get it occasionally with Christie, and it's more often than not the more celebrated works of Christie, because I would argue that another short, nasty, and brutish short story is Traitor Hands, which is the basis for Witness for the Prosecution.
Yes.
And in novel form, And Then There Were None.
Yeah, right.
So what's unusual about this story is how little known it is.
Yeah, I don't think that before we were preparing for this, I don't recall having ever read this story. Did you?
No, me neither. And actually, I think we could also make a comparison to Philomel Cottage, which we just mentioned, also in this collection, because it too is an unusual short, nasty, and brutish Christie story. But that actually was adapted a lot in Christie's earlier career. Right. It's a little bit fallen out of favor recently, but it seems to have had its day. And there was a West End production of it that I think is actually still going on. We certainly see it in our Google alerts all the time. So this one just really seems to be a bit more under the radar than it deserves.
Yeah, so everybody go read it. And saying that, what is the setup here, Kemper?
So the setup is that former Inspector Evans is chatting with his neighbor, Captain Haydock, and Inspector Evans is insistent that Mrs. Merrodine, one of their other neighbors, is actually the former Mrs. Anthony, a suspected murderess. And there was a trial, but she was acquitted because her husband had a history of arsenic eating, so it appeared as though one day he had just overdone it. And no one has said anything to Mrs. Merrodine about whether or not she may be Mrs. Anthony, but Inspector Evans is sure.
And also, how do you go about saying to your neighbor, So
are you a murderer?
Yeah.
But the thing is, and this is sort of what Catherine's talking about with the tonal clue, we know right away, like within a page, that yes, she is. She is the former Mrs. Anthony, and she is a murderer, and she's going to somehow murder again, because that's just the type of story that we're in.
Yeah, we know. You can look at the length of it. You can see what the premise is in the first sentence or two, and there is a sense of impending doom here.
Right. Exactly. We know what's going to happen. We just don't know exactly how it's going to happen.
Captain Haydock, unfortunately, well, I guess, or maybe fortunately for him, is not having any of this. He finds it just like frightful that this woman who is like a perfectly good neighbor, she's lived there for a long time, and now all of a sudden his friend is like putting these accusations up that even if she was Mrs. Anthony, she was acquitted. Right. Why should she have to suffer through something when she already had to suffer through it once?
She had her day in court. She had due process. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He's very suspicious of what Evans is doing, and he kind of clocks it, and he asks if Evans has something that he needs to tell him. Was something not said in the trial that he knows because he was in CID?
And there is something that he knows. He has some special information here, which is that in her teens, the woman in question, Mrs. Anthony, had been on a cliff sidewalk, never never a good idea to walk on a cliff with someone you don't fully trust in a Christie story. She was walking on the cliff with her stepfather, who disapproved of her love interest. And said stepfather had a wee bit of an accident, tumbled down the cliff to his death, just like that poor man who subsequently asked, why didn't they ask Evans?
That's exactly what. Well, and I will note we are dealing with Inspector Evans.
And we are dealing with Inspector Evans. And also, since we're talking about the names in this story, I believe that Haydock shares the surname with Dr. Haydock, who hails from St. Mary Mead and features in some Miss Marple stories. So maybe there's a connection there. Maybe Captain Haydock and Dr. Haydock are brothers or cousins. Something.
I mean, exciting connections abound.
You know what this story needs to not have the ghoulish ending that it has? Miss Marple. Because she would have nipped this in the bud.
That, or I'm going to make a suggestion up front. It's that this is possibly a story that Miss Marple would later use as an illustration for something else.
Totally. So Haydock still thinks that this is all best left to history and that Evans should not say anything, that he should mind his own beeswax. That is probably in many ways the lesson to be learned in this short story, if there is one to be learned, that people should mind their own business. But guess who doesn't mind his own business?
Evans.
Yep.
You know, why didn't they ask Evans?
Why did Evans ask?
Why did Evans ask?
That's the alternate title. Alternate title.
Before this point, he and Haydock have actually been visiting with Mr. Marrodine, who is a former chemistry professor. They've been friendly, but they've been looking at his lab, and because Evans has already been suspicious of the missus, he's now extra concerned. So he basically stalks Mrs. Marrodine at the local fair, which does not seem like a good idea. Then on top of that, he goes and sees a fortune teller, which I will tell you a fortune, Kemper.
Please do.
The fortune is, if you are in, especially Christie's story, but in many a crime story, if you go to see a fortune teller, things probably are not going to bode well for you.
This is true. There are very few stories in which a character has his or her fortune read and a happy result from that experience.
A fortune teller in a short story in particular is a Chekhov's gun. And and her name is also Zara the fortune teller, which is just perfect.
You know, it's a really major exception to that fortune teller rule. It's in a novel, not a short story.
What?
Jane Eyre. I know it's not your favorite, Catherine.
It's not my favorite.
The exception is when the fortune teller turns out to be Mr. Rochester in drag. Spoiler, listeners, Zara is not Mr. Rochester in drag.
Although we don't know intriguing. That, actually.
We actually don't know that. It's true.
We don't find out anything more, so it's a distinct possibility.
Well, so he finds out from the fortune teller that death is in his future, and of course he thinks this has to do with Mrs. Marrodine killing her current husband.
Right.
And then he also finds out that Mr. Marrodine has just taken out a life insurance policy at his wife's behest.
Mm-hmm. And then also her last husband, Mr. Anthony, had also just taken out a life insurance policy that gave everything to her, you know, like 2 or 3 weeks before he overdid it on the arsenic eating.
So Evans here decides to take matters into his own hands, that this is enough, and he, at the fair, right?
Correct.
He calls Mrs. Marrodine Mrs. Anthony on purpose and watches as the realization hits her. And then Mrs. Marrodine / Anthony invites him over for tea.
Because that seems like a good idea.
And he goes because the fly walks right on into the spider's web every time.
Well, and also, you know, I mean, he is a retired investigator.
Police inspector.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he should actually have a good head on his shoulders, or a better head on his shoulders for these sorts of scenarios than your average person.
Well, and I will also say that we are very much, and I think unusually in a lot of ways for a Christie story, we're very much in his head during all of this. And what he really thinks is nobody else is preventing a crime.
Right. He thinks that this is it all rests on his shoulders. I mean, he is the prototypical nosy Parker, right? Or busybody. He thinks that he has to do it and the world was not going to be set right if not for him. So he's just got to get on up in everyone's business.
I mean, it also goes in an interesting way to what we talk about a lot is the idea of extra legal justice, right? Like he thinks that she escaped these 2 other crimes that she committed. Mm-hmm. And now she's going to commit a 3rd one and nobody's going to do anything about it. And this poor guy who he's kind of fond of, who's like a dweeb, this guy has no idea that he's going to be murdered. And it's true. There's a guy in the story who has no idea he's going to be murdered.
This is true. Let's get there. So what happens at tea, Catherine?
You know, she explains to him that they drink tea in the Chinese style. So in sipping bowls and not teacups. And she prepares a brew of fancy stuff that she has, but she's been complaining to her husband this whole time that the bowls, they keep popping up in his experiments in his lab, and the maid keeps putting them back into the kitchen, and she's getting really over it, and she kind of jokes that one day he's gonna poison all of them by accident because he's been doing chemical experiments with their drinking glasses.
Mr. Meridine storms off to his lab to check that the maid has not messed with anything else. And that is when Evans confronts the woman across the table, Mrs. Meridine, and he challenges her to drink the tea that she just made for her husband. And this is where, even though we have no clues and this isn't a puzzle mystery, I think we should switch to the world as it actually is, because if we were still in the world as it appears to be, what would happen here is that Evans would have foiled the plan, right? That she was intending to poison her husband, and he called her out. The end. But that's not quite what happens, is it, Catherine?
He says, Mrs. Meridine, I'm a man of queer whims. Will you be very kind and indulge me in one of them? She looked inquiring but unsuspicious. He rose, took the bowl from in front of her, and crossed to the little table where he substituted it for the other, i.e., the other is her husband's. This other he brought back and placed in front of her. I want to see you drink this.
Her reaction is such that we think he's got her. This is her reaction. Her eyes met his. They were steady, unfathomable. The color slowly drained from her face. She stretched out her hand, raised the cup. He held his breath, supposing all along he had made a mistake. She raised it to her lips. At the last moment, with a shudder, she leant forward and quickly poured it into a pot containing a fern. Then she sat back and gazed at him defiantly. So seems, she was about to poison her husband and she couldn't go through with it. And he then very patronizingly essentially says, you thought you were smart, but you weren't smart enough for me. And I think you understand me. There must be no repetition. You know what I mean? And she says, I know what you mean. And what happens next? Because we are almost done, but not quite.
Evans makes the air of slightly arrogant people everywhere. You don't ever underestimate who you are talking to. He raises his glass of tea to his lips.
His bowl.
And the line is, to your long life and to that of your husband, he said significantly and raised his tea to his lips. Then his face changed. It contorted horribly. He tried to rise, to cry out. His body stiffened. His face went purple. He fell back, sprawling over his chair, his limbs convulsed. Mrs. Meridine leaned forward, watching him. A little smile crossed her lips. She spoke to him very softly and gently. You made a mistake, Mr. Evans. You thought I wanted to kill George. How stupid of you. How very stupid. Because guess what? She actually loves her current husband. Surprise!
That's the twist. The twist is that she's happily married. She finally figured it out.
Yeah.
She's winning. She's winning at love and life. So she married the right man.
I love the line also. Her smile broadened. She looked more than ever like a Madonna. Then she raised her voice and called, George, George, oh, do come here. I'm afraid there's been the most dreadful accident. Poor Mr. Evans.
And that is the end of the story.
It's delightfully mean.
Yeah, nasty, brutish, and short. Because it ends exactly as we knew it was going to end, with this woman murdering someone.
It's clear from the very beginning of the story. It's just one of those stories where you're like, how is this going to happen?
She ends up murdering the one who just wouldn't leave well enough alone.
Right. And I mean, he was clearly right. Clearly she murdered the other two people.
Sure. No, I mean, and Christie really makes that clear. I mean, the only part we didn't read from that last page is she sat there a minute longer looking at the dead man, the third man who had threatened to cross her path and separate her from the man she loved.
Yeah, she loves this nerdy little, retired chemistry professor.
He signed his own death warrant by virtue of his pushiness and curiosity and sense of superiority.
Sense of superiority and need for, this extra legal justice, which it's funny because, he very easily could be like a Poirot or a Miss Marple. They would do something similar to what he did.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that he isn't good enough at it to not have seen what was coming.
Miss Marple would have seen it.
Yeah, well, he thought he was smarter than her, and he wasn't.
And he wasn't.
The thing that works about this is how effectively it's written, and that's why I wanted to start talking about it with the tone. And the only two things that I would note is that it actually functions in a short story way, differently than I think a lot of her stories do. And I know, Kemper, I mentioned this to you before, but the thing that it reminded me a lot of was A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Absolutely. Flannery O'Connor, right?
Flannery O'Connor, and maybe the classic of all classic 20th century short stories.
I think that's fair.
Which, starts with somebody reading about a serial killer in the paper and thinking about how they're going to avoid the serial killer.
So they're going to be killed by a serial killer. Right. And I mean, the other one that I mentioned to you was Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, which is Joyce Carol Oates. And it's another one of those, if you are in 9th grade in the United States and you have to be handed a book of American short stories, those two short stories are showing up in them. And then they show up again if you talk about, I think, crime fiction, because both of them are essentially about crimes, about dread. They're about dread. What's really funny is that this short story features a detective, but it is not detective fiction. This is crime fiction.
Yeah, it is.
Right? It's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Right. And about the fiction of dread, about knowing about something and not having any ability to do anything about it, even if you think you do. And the reader knows that, we just got off of And Then There Were None. This predates that by 10 years, but it functions in a very similar way.
You could see the writer of And Then There Were None in this story and in some of those other short stories we referenced that are similar to this one. Philomel Cottage, Trader Hands, that is the same sort of writer who went on to do And Then There Were None. That inevitability, the doom and the inexorability of fate, this is going to happen and it's preordained and there's just nothing you can do about it. I mean, that obviously is a literary trope from Oedipus Rex right on down. It's effective, it's powerful, and she's using it to its full effect in these stories.
Yeah, I just think it's remarkably talented writing in a very specific way that you don't necessarily see that often in the short stories.
Or in the novels.
Yeah,
really.
No, I know. And I don't know that she gets enough credit for how effective something like this is.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, even though we're certainly making the point that it's not what she usually wrote, it's not like this was a one-off, as we've now read enough that we know that she's done this a couple of times. She certainly had the ability to do it, and she obviously only chose to do it every now and then. She didn't do the nasty, short, and brutish route very often, and I have to imagine that it just didn't necessarily suit her personality, and she didn't want to do it all the time. But when she wanted to do it, she could certainly do it.
It would be hard to do that all the time.
Like Shirley Jackson did it all the time.
Sure, well, yeah, that had to have taken a toll. The only other one that I would have mentioned is Stephen King. And, there's one that I really love. I think I've mentioned on this podcast before. It's actually late Stephen King. I think it's like in the last 10 years. But there's a short story called The Road Virus Heads North that if you haven't read it, I would read it with lights on. It's about a painting and about a road trip. And it functions similarly. And I really love that story, not because it doesn't scare the living daylights out of me, but because it functions just solely as dread. And I think it's what she does in this and what she does in And Then There Were None. And it's just remarkable because then she can just switch off to something else, and credit where credit is due.
100%.
And also, I do think the comparison to Trader Hands is very accurate because the twist at the end is the same.
It has the same bite to it.
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm.
It has the same thunk, the end. This thing is tightly constructed.
Yeah.
This short story should be anthologized. Middle schoolers would love this story. I think this would turn on a lot of young readers.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, that is Accident. Lovely short story by Agatha Christie within the Listerdale Mystery Collection, or the Witness for the Prosecution and Other Stories collection. So I guess actually quite apt that it's within that collection in the U.S. Yeah. And next week we will be covering our next novel, Sad Cypress, Hercule Poirot. We are very excited to be back with our dear Papa Poirot.
Absolutely.
We'd love to hear from you in the meantime via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Tweet at Catherine at Brobcat. She would love to hear from you. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we love getting the ratings and reviews from you. Please keep them coming. It really helps other people find the podcast. And we just love hearing from you.
Yeah, and also thank you so much to everybody who has emailed us or sent us messages on social media, especially about And Then There Were None, because you guys have been really lovely and great, and we tremendously appreciate it.
That was a lot of fun doing that episode, and you made it more fun with your responses and engagement. So thank you for that. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.